much is. But let me begin actually with an apology. And I begin with an apology because we have framed this session incorrectly. We have fallen into the trap that many fall into when they talk about forest footprints. We've talked about removing a forest footprint. Well, actually, what we should be talking about is enhancing a positive forest contribution or footprint. And what I mean by that is deforestation has dominated much of the corporate agenda around sourcing for 10, 15 years or so. But we are now shifting much more towards regeneration, restoration, protection, alongside production of important natural materials. And of course, without economic incentives, without growth in a sustainable way, and without communities having income and being able to feed their families and have healthcare and education, forests will not be standing. So like it or not, hard left, we do have to have economic activity in and around forests and forest landscapes. So the question is, how do we do that well? And how does that contribute to the apparel and textile supply chain so that companies like yours, organizations like yours can go out there and say, we are sourcing from an environment where we are having a positive impact, not just on forest protection, but also on restoration and community development. A huge number of poorer people, as we know, live in tropical areas, and it's essential that their well-being is enhanced, and corporate supply chains are a way of doing that if managed sustainably. Now, we need to get away from the idea of just leaving areas completely untouched, because they won't be untouched. They'll be exploited by much less sustainably minded individuals than the ones on the call today. So that's a change in paradigm from the title, but I think an important clarification. We have here three very interesting organizations heavily involved in working literally on the ground and in the forest and around the forest, or in Niels' case, above the forests, looking at exactly how what I've just said gets put into action. So I'm delighted to turn to our panel for some opening comments on how we can have forest positive footprints and make sure we avoid the negative impacts when we talk about sourcing and how that impacts the apparel and footwear sector. So Beto Bina from Vezia, let me turn to you first, Beto. We've been speaking a number of times recently at conferences and elsewhere about the work you're doing in important areas such as the Amazon. So I'd love to hear about that and how what you've learned can be applied to the wider apparel and textile sector in terms of having a positive forest impact. Beto.
Sure. Thank you so much, Toby. I'm super happy to be here. My name is Beto Bina. As Toby said, I'm head of sourcing at Vezia. The right way to say is Vezia because the meaning is in Portuguese. It means to see what's beyond the product. And of course, forests, one of the main projects we work with, it's with wild rubber or native rubber. This only happens in the Amazon because the rubber trees are from the Amazon, and basically we work right now with over 1,000 communities, and these producers that get into the jungle, they walk on these trails, and they can find around one rubber tree per hectare. So they need to walk a lot. They tap about 100 trees at a time, and then they go back home with this latex, which we use in our soles, insoles, and we're evolving to use a lot more. Why is that important? So I'm not sure how much time do I have, but super quick. It is important to have or to provide income for these communities with a standing forest. Unfortunately, in Brazil, most of you have been following about deforestation rates. Today in Brazil, a deforested land has more value than a standing forest. And that's crazy because you have a standing forest, you have all these ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and even legacy of these people that came from the forest. Right now in Brazil, you have about 25 million people living in the Amazon region, and you need to find alternatives way for them to generate income and have dignity to work with a standing forest. That's one of the main projects. I can talk more about it later.
Thanks. I mean, I suppose the obvious question is, as your company grows, how do you avoid that one tree per hectare becoming 100 or 500 and having your company's growth contribute to monoculture and deforestation, which is a risk with.
So in the past, early 19th century, because of the First War and the Second War, most of the rubber used to came from the Amazon regions because we didn't have in Southeast Asia or other regions the rubber. So they used to have way more. There's tons of opportunities. The communities that work there, they really want to work more with rubber. There's not much of demand because it's hard work. It's tough to get into the jungle. It's tough to work with all these cooperatives. We work with about 20 cooperatives that we need to go in the field. I'm just representing one of them here, which is super fan of ours. So it's a lot of investment. And for a brand to commit to do that is just hard. But indeed, there's a lot of space to grow and to harvest more white rubber. But you got a really important point. There's a lot of deforested land that you could also work with rubber trees of cultivation using agroforestry and other sustainable methods of growing forests from scratch.
Thank you, Beto. And the obvious question for a sort of ethical, sustainable brand like yours is, it's all very well having a nice virtue signaling product that we can wear and feel like we're making a sustainable contribution as a consumer. But how do you have a kind of leveraged impact on the rest of the industry to drive sustainability practices? Because that's really the role of ethical brands, isn't it? Rather than focusing just on your own impact, it's actually to amplify the message and to get other larger sourcing companies involved in the journey. How are you going about doing that?
I think the main focus for us, Toby, is to be as transparent as possible. So I think the industry right now just got a little bit obsessed with carbon, which is super important. Carbon is one unit metric that you can measure your impact, right? I think, of course, all the Paris Agreement is super important. We're looking into this carbon issue, and then we're doing our role there. So just launched a full page explaining everything we do with everything open about the carbon and doing more initiatives. So we develop a new methodology, not new methodology, but we use the RED Plus methodology from the UN of avoided deforestation to generate carbon credits for these families. And we will also develop a tool. It's a satellite monitoring tool. Niels are gonna like it because we are actually mapping all the producers and see where's the high or low risk of deforestation. If you have a low risk of deforestation, we pay a conservation bonus for these families. All this content, everything we're doing, we're putting out there for people to see and understand and see how it works. We truly believe that the process, it's becoming the concept of brands. So the process is actually telling way more what brand does. It's telling way more than just a marketing campaign with a bunch of influencers.
Excellent, Beto. Yeah, we'll come back to that conversation. I want to ask you about that incentives for smallholders and forest communities, particularly around ecosystem services. It's incredibly important. I'm sure Niels will have some comments around that as well in terms of the monitoring technology. But let me turn over now to Cherie Tan from Asia Pacific Rayon. Cherie, thanks for joining us from Singapore. And I'm really interested to hear your views on how we can have forest positive footprints for the apparel and textiles sector. Obviously, you're one of the world's significant viscose producers. And it'll be interesting to hear from you how in a country like Indonesia, those products can be made sustainably and in fact enhance forests and supply chains. So Cherie, over to you for some opening comments, and then we'll have some questions.
Thanks again, Toby, for once again inviting me to this panel discussion and innovation forum. So good evening, good morning, everyone. So a little bit of a background, Asia Pacific Rayon. Our mill is located in Riau on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. So we operate in a very unique landscape and a very unique business model in that we're vertically integrated, operating alongside our sister company, April. They manage forest plantations. They process the wood fiber into dissolving pulp that APR then uses to make viscose for the textile industry. We've been operating since 2019, and in 2020, we've also further invested downstream into yarn and fabric development and established the Jakarta Fashion Hub in collaboration with fashion designers and our customers to integrate viscose into Indonesia's growing fashion scene. So a bit of an overview on viscose or the man-made cellulosic sector. The annual production volume is around 6.7 million tons, and it's approximately growing. It represents 6.2% of the total fiber production. I think, to answer your question, Toby, we really kind of see the interplay of our business in supporting three key aspects. Really, it's about strengthening our footprint, becoming climate positive, and really operating in a model that we call production and protection. So for that, April manages forest plantations, and their commitment is that for every hectare of plantations that they manage, they're also conserving 1 hectare of forest areas. And this model is largely worked, this production protection model is largely worked at a landscape level. And one of the things that we are doing alongside April is really making a commitment to take a percentage of our revenues from viscose production and put that towards forest restoration and supporting wildlife conservation. And it really includes expanding the conservation areas outside of our own operating footprint, ensuring a zero net loss of protected forest areas to achieve measurable gains in ecosystem values. And then the other area is really that operating in a rural community in Riau, we take a 50-kilometer radius along our operations and really support efforts to drive inclusive prosperity in the supply chain and advance gender equity. So it's really creating an ecosystem that generates values for the community and the people we work alongside. We have initiatives that support nutrition, supporting women in income generation, looking at traditional textile development, and really driving inclusive growth, supporting schools and health programs. And then the third area is really supporting the industry in advancing circular systems. We're committed to moving away from this linear business model of take, make, and waste towards more circular systems by investing in innovations, looking at how we can take textile waste and regenerate that into the production process, how we can minimize the impacts by using less chemicals and innovating in the technology on the production so that we're making a positive environmental footprint. So this is really ultimately about supporting the industry, supporting the growth of the Indonesian sector, and then ensuring an inclusive prosperity with the communities that we work with.
Thank you, Sherry. Let me ask you a question about the chemical recycling aspect of viscose production in a minute, because that's a significant factor for viscose. I want to know where you're up to with that, because it's an important factor. But just to let you all know, I've been out to see the plant that Sherry refers to just before the COVID situation, and I posted a link to a podcast I recorded with their head of operations, which is in the middle of a protected forest. So there's a lot of bird noise in it. And there was a tiger around in the area while we were there, although we didn't come across him, thankfully. So I've seen it firsthand, and it is a remarkable situation where you are, Sherry, because it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and the forest that isn't protected by large companies is at serious risk. And I've seen that. And yet I've seen the forest that you're preserving and restoring. But viscose does use a lot of chemicals. Where are you up to on the chemical side of things in terms of managing that footprint?
Yeah, so one of the things, Toby, that the viscose industry has worked towards is working alongside ZDHC in the establishment of guidelines for responsible viscose production, looking at the way we manage our waste streams and looking at the chemical inputs. So one of our commitments is to ensure the recovery of the chemicals that's used in the production, minimize its impact, and recovering as much as 95% of the chemicals that go into producing viscose. And I think largely this is also to do with a lot of advancements that have happened in technology and manufacturing, such that we can actually recover as much of the chemicals by really investing in state-of-the-art new technology in the viscose sector, and also accelerating R&D to look at alternative chemicals that we could be using in our production processes.
So how are you getting the message across to customers, Cherie? I mean, there's a lot of terminology around here, isn't there? There's regenerative, there's forest positive, there's protection and production, and really what you're doing, as far as I can see, is keeping plantations stable, producing a circular product, as I can envisage in viscose, and actually using some of the income to enhance and protect and preserve forests. So it's got a good ethos about it, but what do you call it when you talk to customers about it? Because it must be confusing for them to try and understand what you're doing without seeing it, as I have, and I didn't really understand it until I saw it. So it's a challenge, isn't it, to tell people about this? Well, how do you do that?
Yeah, so I think that there are really three ways that we try to do this. One is really about supporting the industry efforts to really define the future for net positive man-made cellulosic fiber. So APR has largely supported Forum for the Future and Textile Exchange to envision what this future for net positive cellulose would look like in 2030, which is really about taking in elements of circularity, regenerative, protecting rights of workers, and striving landscapes. Then the second aspect is, because of our integrations, we can also demonstrate the full traceability of our raw materials back to the source of where the material was grown, the conservation initiatives that we support, and we do this through a traceability platform powered by blockchain called followourfiber.com. And you can actually see the full visibility of our supply chain. And we use this as a way of communicating the impacts of what we're doing all along the supply chain of our raw material to the production of viscose. And finally, the third one is really actually generating much more positive partnerships alongside communities with the Indonesian textile sector to really develop and build a vibrant textile sector, and actually showcasing those stories, be it through the Jakarta Fashion Hub in collaboration with many fashion designers, using it as a space to look at collaboration on post-consumer waste, sorting out recycled systems for textile, and the stories that we're supporting community initiatives with women's empowerment groups all along our communities to support, traditional textile craftsmanship. And these are stories that is very consumer facing, that we do via the Jakarta Fashion Hub.
Thank you. Niels, let me turn to you. You've been working in this space for a long time. Some of you in this audience may know that Innovation Forum has worked on deforestation and forestry and land use issues for a long time, including with Niels and his company. Niels, what have you observed over the last 5 years? So, am I right in characterizing the shift away from forests as a negative, zero deforestation as a must, net zero deforestation, which turns out to be almost impossible as far as I can tell, towards this more forest positive story, which Beto and Cherie are good examples of? Do you see that shift happening? And how do you think that can benefit the apparel and textiles industry as they try and tell the story of their sourcing?
Yeah, no, we couldn't agree more, Toby, with a focus on forest positive stories, because although it's important to address the negative issues, it kind of overshadows all the hard work many companies are doing to increase traceability and reducing their impact. So here at Stelligence, we help companies like Vezia and APR to communicate with independent science-based proof up to the origin, so the farm level, that they maintain or improve even forest resilience, which helps to increase accountability and trust. And I think, just as Beto said, it's not just the marketing. People need more proof these days. So for a positive story is important, but then many are also need to move beyond certification alone, looking for more third-party assurance. And I think that is also a part of the story here. So a need for more positive stories, but also a need for more accountability. Yeah, that's what we're working on. And if we talk about forests, we are doing a lot of work on raw materials, for example, in cocoa, soy, palm oil, with brands including Wilmar, Olam, Bunge, Dreyfus, but also consumer good brands like Mondelez, PepsiCo, Unilever, etc. We're talking about fashion here, and what for me is very interesting is that we can see how all those lessons learned in other commodities, how they can help also in the fashion sector. And if we're talking about forests, what are we talking about? We're talking about forest fibers, so viscose and rayon, but also pulp and paper for packaging. Talking about packaging, sugarcane is something for alternative to plastics. We're talking about leather, we're talking about cotton. In the natural rubber sector, indeed, as Betta will tell more about, we've seen a lot of new emphasis on restoring forests and maintaining forests. And I think, yeah, that's all positive work. With the satellite, we can now provide the proof, where is actually this forest? Where is actually this rubber, jungle rubber or plantation rubber? Where is cotton? Can we provide proof that forest has not been cleared? Can we provide proof, like in the Amazon last year, that the forest has not been burned? Can we provide proof that areas are planted and that companies are actually walking the talk and re-greening the planet by replanting? Or that areas where cotton is planted are not degrading due to water stress? We can now on a daily basis see all that with satellites, and that links very much to what companies like APR are doing with increasing traceability. So these are trends that we have seen towards a more forest positive future in the recent past and technology.
Thank you, Niels. And when it comes to the ecosystem services and incentivizing smallholders to keep forests standing, we know that's a significant issue. We know there are issues with organized crime in deforestation. We know there are issues with large companies expanding and illegal activities, although those are way down in certain markets, particularly Indonesia. But often around the world, it's inch by inch deforestation, isn't it? By rural poverty, grinding rural poverty on the edges of forests with people with very few shoes and not enough education and resources, who do this to feed their families. And of course, one of the things we always talk about is how do we create incentives for them to keep forests standing, and how do we tell that story? Because unless we have that rural development, we're not going to be able to keep forests standing and keep restoring them. What have you observed about how that debate's moving forward? Because that is going to be very important for the apparel and textile sector. If they're really diving into their footprint, they can't ignore that issue, can they?
Yeah, I think the trend of knowing who your suppliers are, you can only work with them if you know who they are and where they are. So having supply chain mapping increasingly available helps also to address the impact in the forests. And I think that last year we've seen a lot of new initiatives on also mapping carbon stocks to see whether they increase. For example, companies like Olam, we are cooperating to see where all the farms are that are in their supply chain, and if the carbon stock in the vegetation, in the agroforest that they're managing, if that's increasing. And that can help also with net zero programs and also voluntary removal of carbon from the atmosphere, provide new income opportunities for these farmers as a part of a broader action towards doing more on achieving net zero. There's the Rabobank, which aims to become the first carbon bank. They are setting up a marketplace also for smallholders for increasing the number of trees in their agroforests. And we were working with them as well. So we see quite a lot of new initiatives and hopefully, as Beto also said, using carbon. Carbon is not the only thing. It's also about biodiversity. It's about livelihoods. It's about the whole scheme. And it is one additional opportunity, but also for increasing access to finance for smallholders to do the right thing.
And how is technology evolving to monitor what's happening on the ground? And not a lot of people understand, I think, myself included, just how much technology has evolved and how much cheaper it is. I mean, it used to be very expensive to use satellites. You had to be a space agency or a bond villain or a national government. These days, well, how cheap is it, and what can you see, and what are companies that you're working with actually seeing on the ground? What are they using it for? Kind of bring it to life for us, Niels.
Sure. Yeah. How to keep that short? You can buy satellite images, or increasingly they come freely available, paid by taxpayers with satellites from ESA, NASA, and Japan, etc. Brazil also has satellites. So also the ability to interpret these satellite images is increasing. We have cloud computing to be able to do that over global supply chains of companies. And that has made it more possible than years ago. What we do is that translate this information also into alerts. As Beto said, what are the high risk areas? What are the low risk areas? And this kind of information can help also to address specific suppliers. So if you know where a supplier is, if he's doing a good job, or if there's some room for improvement, it's a possibility to directly engage with them. So yeah, we've seen a lot more embracing of this approach of using the satellite information together with the supply chain information, the contextualization, to engage, to adapt sourcing contracts, etc.
Thank you. Beto, you wanted to come in with a comment. And audience, if you'd like to say something, raise your hand, as you can see Beto has done, or let us know on the chat and we'll come to you. Beto.
I was just too excited because what Neil mentioned, it's a passion of mine, especially working with these communities. One of the things we found out in Brazil, which is a crazy data, that only 5% of people that lives in the Amazon work with forestry. The other works with either agriculture or commerce or services. So people don't work with the forest. They really try to work against the forest. The history in Brazil was pretty much getting people from other regions, especially Northeast, and they put them inside the forest to start working with rubber. That was back in the days. But these people that came from different regions, especially in the semi-arid, they used to plant rice, beans, and have cattle. That's what they know. Their families used to do that. That's their vocation. When you put them in the forest, what they will do is exactly the same thing they have been doing for years and years, and never try to understand how they can actually work alongside and together with the forest. So we really need to change this mentality of having large-scale monoculture of commodities when we're working with forests, because forest doesn't work this way, right? Forest, it's this huge biodiversity of so many elements interrelated. So if a brand needs to work or wants to work to protect the forest, you shouldn't have this monochromatic one point of view. You really need to work in collaboration with other industries. One of the things we really want to do right now is look at the forest or maybe an agroforestry and work alongside with like a food company or a cosmetic company or a medicine company, and work together with the same community so the community can have different markets to sell their productions. I think that's it's a different point of view, and it's a different way to work than the traditional monoculture point of view.
Yes, absolutely. I posted a link just below here about the difference between tree planting and forests. And I think that's quite important to understand, because on the other side of things, if you're looking at working on your impact, and you're looking at tree planting as a solution, caveat emptor, as they say in Latin, buyer beware, because you may be putting resources in the wrong place. To Beto's point, investing in proper forest landscapes and protection and restoration is far better than monoculture tree planting for its own sake. Sherry, let me bring you in here. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think Niels kind of made an important point, which is really about moving beyond looking at risk management within sourcing policies and really driving much more impact on the ground. And I can really appreciate what you've done, Toby, to really shift this conversation to not talk about the negative impact of forest products, but really how do we deliver more impact for the community. And as a integrated forest company, we are committed to the long-term development, not just of the company, but also working alongside our communities to offer a sustained livelihoods for the communities. And there are a lot of challenges in Indonesia. The income disparity between rural farming communities and even urban areas, that private sector companies like ourselves have a role and responsibility to really work in partnership with regional governments and the communities to find a sustained source of livelihoods for many of the communities that we work with, not just in job creation, but helping them identify income. So if the communities, not many of the communities might want to get involved in the forestry sector. They actually want to have other sources of income from farming, and we support them through our community development initiatives by helping them get access to markets and by helping them deliver higher income, because ultimately it's about the impact that we're making on the communities, and it's also the impact that we're making within our production to support more forest conservation in the landscape where we operate.
Thank you, Shri. It's an incredibly important point. You can't separate rural development and diversification of income, sustainable diversification of income from these issues, and it's incredibly important. And I was very impressed when I went to see your project, Shri, about how you're training smallholder farmers and rural communities to have diverse incomes, so they don't have to rely on going in the forest, because those forests are pretty impenetrable places. If you have another alternative, that's what you'll do, and it's about creating those opportunities for communities rather than, as Beto says, having them work against the forest. That was a fascinating stat, by the way, Beto. Only 5%. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? People are not so different. I remember seeing a famous management theorist saying, how do you work out what a CEO will do in a new company that he joins? Look at what he did, or she. Look at what he or she did in the last company, and they'll do the same thing in the next one. People are not so different, whether they're managing companies or they're in a rural or forest environment. As you can tell, audience, we do a lot of work on this. So there are a huge number of podcasts and webinars and articles on our website. I've posted a few links, but there are lots more. If you want to know about forest footprints, it's a lot of what we do. And I think it's very important that if you take one thing away from this session, is that you can source forest products sustainably. You just have to work hard to do it. And it could be one of the most important sourcing decisions you make in support of the SDGs and in support of tackling climate change. You just have to do it in a smart way and not be lazy and do tree planting offsetting and go for zero forestry footprint. We did put that in our title, but it gave us a provocative thing to discuss here. We've got a few questions coming in here. Let's have one here from Miriam. So Miriam says, what sort of certifications do you work with on sustainable forest management? If so, which ones? And I would add to that, how do you see those certifications needing to evolve to take account of those wider issues? Because that's been, in my view, some of the problem with certifications. It's been too narrow. So Shri, what do you think about that, and who are you working with?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. So at APR, we have a sustainable sourcing policy. And since day one of our operations, we've committed to sourcing 100% of all of our pulp from certified sources. And currently the majority of that is PEFC and then controlled sources. But we don't just stop at certification. It's really also about delivering much more impact around forest conservation, and then providing the full visibility of our supply chain and the traceability of that through a platform, Follow Our Fiber, where you can track the certifications that we have obtained both at product manufacturing and sourcing level within APR's mill, the dissolving pulp mills, and the forest plantations.
Thank you. Helpful clarification. Now, who has something they want to say? I can see there's 41 of us here. You can turn your camera on and ask a question. Don't be shy. Or you can put it in the chat function if you are feeling shy. Or if you're feeling too shy, I will just carry on asking questions. I could do this all day. In fact, I do it all often. Beto.
Can I bring another point here?
Please do.
So I think it's important to see not just talk about forest, but talk about native biomes, right? So, for example, there's a biome in the south of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay called Pampa, which is a short grassland, super biodiverse, so many animals, so many different types of species, and what almost designed for cattle. So cattle loves to eat the grass, but the good side is that, okay, you don't need to deforest and plant pasture because the cattle really likes to eat the grass from the native biome. So you don't need to deforest in order to raise cattle, right? So I think it's important to look at the biome and bring it back to the previous point, which is trying to work together with these biomes. Not necessarily needs to be a forest, could be any type of biome. If you look at outside your window right now, I'm in the Atlantic forest right now in São Paulo. You can look at that and how actually you can work alongside with these trees and all these elements. I think that's super important. And I also want to jump a little bit on the Neil's subject here, which is it's so important to have these satellites, but also it's important to have the dialogue, right? So you have the data provided from these quantitative, super high-tech instruments, but when you are dealing with smallholders, you need to go to the field, right, Niels? Because sometimes the satellites we use from Brazilian government, they are pretty good, but they don't get as narrow as like 1 hectare size or even smaller. So the work we are doing is okay, the satellites, it's an insight, it's an information, but then you go to the field to really discuss and debate to find the right solutions.
Thank you. Let me ask you more about leather, Beto. I mean, if you look at deforestation stats, you know, Brazil is, as you well know more than me, is, you know, it's many thousands of square kilometers a year of land being deforested, despite there being millions of hectares of degraded land that could be developed on. Now we know, you know, the government's had something to do with this in terms of not stopping it or encouraging it, and cattle has been seen as the primary driver. And companies like JBS and others have been mired in problems for many years. It all looks a bit bleak when you look at Brazilian leather or Brazilian cattle products. It all seems a bit bleak. Are there any rays of light there around sustainable Brazilian leather? Could you take some of the work you're doing and source sustainable leather from the Amazon or from that region or close to that region and make it something people could aspire to? Is that too naive a pipe dream to suggest, or is that something you've been discussing?
That's a super important topic, Toby. And I think the challenge, especially with leather and meat, is about the indirect farms, because you need to trace back since where the cattle was basically born. And when you think about the lands and the price of cattle in Amazonian region, it's half the price of other Brazilian regions. So what they're doing, they are buying cattle from there, they're raising confinements in middle of Brazil, and then they are selling to this large slaughterhouse that certifies that the farm that sells to them are not in the Amazon, but they don't know where actually the cattle is coming from. So that's a super tough supply chain. What we are doing, it's moving our supply chain to the south. So working the southmost state in Brazil and Uruguay, prioritizing the native field, the native biome, which you don't need to deforest to raise cattle, super important as well. We're trying to work as much as possible, but that's super hard, to work with farmers that do the whole complete cycle from born to the slaughterhouse. So everything happens into the farm, as well as that's another step in the supply chain, but it's using chrome-free leather. Don't use like heavy metals that pollute water streams and so on. That's our effort into that. I truly believe that leather is an amazing product. Durability, performance. I truly believe that it has a role into the fashion industry. I think it's going to decrease, and the variety and diversity of materials will be the next thing, which is super important. But I think it's important to look at leather, not just something that, okay, you should avoid 100%. No, there's some ways to do leather respectfully and environmentally sustainable.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I'm of the firm belief that many of the products that get demonized, almost all of them can be produced sustainably. It's a question of what quantity, what quality, and what impact. And that's very important. Cherie, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think what I can really appreciate in what Beto is saying, and I feel similar at Asia Pacific Rayon, is that as a company, when you're very invested in a community, you are looking at solutions and collaboration to really support the management of the landscape, the partnerships with the community to really deliver impact, and also identifying where the opportunities are. So, at APR and, in the landscape where we operate, we're supporting one of the largest peat dome forest conservation area in all of Rio. It is 7.5 times the size of London, where there is a lot of wildlife and endangered species like tigers, sunda bears, that we are really supporting and protecting wildlife and conservation in the area, and then working alongside communities in and around the forest restoration areas to provide opportunities for sustained livelihoods for them. But also in the landscape where we operate in Riau, where more than 50% of that is on peat area, we're also looking at the impacts we're making on our forest plantations, investing in greenhouse gas flux towers to look at the sequestration of carbon in the landscapes on a plantation, on mixed landscapes with forest conservation areas, and looking at how we can minimize our impact operating in peat landscapes. So this is really about trying to be responsible, doing the right thing, and delivering more impacted solutions.
Thank you, Shri. I mean, it's very important to note that there's great work being done in the supply chain to provide sourcing companies with an opportunity to make positive contributions. And April and Vejia's work are just two examples. Those flux towers are incredible, Shri. I wish your colleagues had told me how much they moved in the wind when you climbed them, because I only realized when I was halfway up it. Luckily, I don't get motion sickness, but it was the longest 50 meters I've ever vertically climbed. But a remarkable achievement to measure GHGs in that forest. And again, an example of what can be done to further research and our understanding of how we get sustainable things from forest landscapes. Very, very important. Maxine Le Floche, you wanted to come in. Do you want to turn on your video and make a point? Could you tell us, Maxine, could you tell us who you work with as well, please?
Yes, sure. I work for a sustainable investment firm called Regnan. I'm based in London. And I just wanted to ask, so actually, Toby, you made that point that everything can be made sustainable and all the issues can be tackled. But then I guess they come with different kind of headaches and costs and time and all that. And to some extent, the different kind of fibers, there is a substitution that can be done by the fashion brands between them. And so I'm trying to understand what's the kind of trend in terms of, for the fashion brands. Obviously, they could go for any fiber, but what's the one where they feel like this is the least costly, the least reputational risk, the least headache in terms of time, resources that they can take. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, isn't that a bit like asking a company which is your best stakeholder? Let's see what they say. I suspect every one of these materials comes with its own challenges. Beto, as a manufacturer, as a brand, any response to that? I imagine it's quite difficult to rank one against the other, isn't it? It's kind of which set of unintended and unfortunate consequences do we want? Do we want this set or do we want this set? Is the answer, I suppose, which one could be better managed? Beto.
There's not an easy answer. Thank you so much, Maxim, for to raise the point. Like our approach, it's really to try to diversify fibers. Like the same as the stock options, we're not putting the whole money into one thing, right? So we used to have just cotton, and then we moved to 65% of the market share. It's polyester now. And then when it comes to leather, you have lots and lots of leather. So we're trying to find many alternatives. And there's these alternatives as like positive and negative sides, right? So for example, jute, it's an amazing fiber. It's not It's actually not from Brazil, from Japan, but grows really well by the rivers. So to the dry season, they plant, and then you get the wet season. Throughout 6 months, they grow, no chemicals, no irrigation. They just grow super easily, lots of carbon sequestration, then they harvest, and then you have jute. But jute is just a coarse and rustic fiber, right? It's not good on the touch. So you need to have a process on how to try to sort of like cottonize jute if you want to use in a garment. And that's another step. So that's a downside of it. But I believe, for example, hemp is similar, right? Hemp is an amazing, a lot of carbon sequestration, no chemicals to be used. But again, you need to get through all these processes. I feel there's not an easy answer. Again, I think my major point is how can we bring more fibers into the table? Amazonia, the Amazon biome has many different fibers. It's so crazy. We just don't use them. We don't know them. Probably we know like 5% of the fibers from the Amazon. If you jump there, try to work, for example, with these communities, not just harvest latex and rubber, but also any other fibers, I think that would be amazing, even though it's not the best quality fibers. So sorry to not give a straightforward answer, Maxime, but we truly believe that it needs to be diversified and have more options in the market.
Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So I feel there has been, up until now, there has been a large focus around looking at raw material sourcing, sustainable sourcing of raw materials, looking at the risk issues around raw materials. And naturally, it's not an easy answer to say what is the trade-off between cotton versus viscose or polyester. And as a viscose manufacturers, we obviously want to make viscose a material of choice, improving on functionality, quality, as well as impacts and offer that to brands. But one thing I would like to suggest and put on the table is also not to look at the raw material impact, but also the impact of where brands are selling their materials and their clothing to, and what kinds of impact are they making to support really the growth of these economies and these markets. If a great percentage of many of the large fashion brands are selling into the Asian markets, how can we actually support and drive and deliver much more purpose and sustainable conscientiousness amongst consumers in these markets? How can we actually support more partnerships and initiatives to deliver more impact in Asia? I sit in many conferences and I see a lot of the innovations and the initiatives largely centered around mature markets. And I would like to see more of the partnerships and delivery and impact happen in the sourcing regions, as well as where these markets, the potential of the growth of where these markets for consumers are as well.
Thank you. Well, Niels, do you want to make a closing comment? We have to finish in a minute, but
yeah, just a quick one, which is fiber replacement a solution for a problem, or is it just displacing? I think that high and low risk assessment is very important, but also as a conversation starter, trying to make problematic areas better, right? So just cleaning up a supply chain by just replacement, yeah, it's an option, but we'd rather have investment in areas where there's also livelihoods being improved and other ecosystems saved rather than replacing areas.
Niels, that's a really good point, and a good point to close on, which is that if you are going to source, and I think we hope you do, forest-related products sustainably, if you do that from somewhere that has a landscape, jurisdictional or regional approach, it shouldn't matter what you source. That should matter less than the fact of where you're sourcing it from. And do they have a plan to improve governance? Is there a plan to improve social capital, rural resilience, and so on? And so I suppose I would encourage you to think about this as a takeaway, is how can you find landscapes and jurisdictions where those governance improvements are being made, where monitoring is happening, where farmers and communities have multiple income streams from multiple products, which helps diversify risk and help them develop sustainably. There are solutions out there. There are a number of landscapes and jurisdictional projects around the world. They're growing all the time. There are REDD+ projects. There are projects like APR's extensive work in Rio, which I've seen personally. And if you'd like to know more about this, you can do two things. One, you can ask us at Innovation Forum, because if we don't know, we know the people who do, and we'll help you connect through Niels or Cherie or Beto. And secondly, if you really wanted to know the detail, you can attend our Landscapes and Commodities Conference at the end of November, which I'm sure Niels, Cherie, and I hope Beto will be at as well, where we spend 2 or 3 days really going into this. And so if you want to know more about forest solutions, that's the event to come to. Meantime, there's a huge amount on our website about this, and we encourage you to ask more questions and engage with us as you need to. So with that, we need to end this session. We've got about 8-minute break, and then we have another round of breakouts. We will see you then. In the meantime, Cherie, Beto, and Niels, thank you so much for your insight and for your time.